Chapter 21, Africa and the Africans in the Age of the Atlantic Slave Trade. We'll be looking at the Atlantic slave trade, African societies, white settlers in southern Africa, and the diaspora of Africa. All right, the Atlantic slave trade, we've started seeing some of this in earlier chapters as well, starting off with the Portuguese, setting up factories, which were the ports and the forts set up along the coast. They just started along the western coast and continue to go all the way down. Establishing Elmina port in 1482, that's the handle part of Africa, that western coast where it starts to curve back under and then go straight down. It's right where that curve meets and it starts to change direction straight southward. Missionaries are followed. They're going to go into the Congo and convert that to Christianity. You still at this time have Ethiopia, the Axum Nubia area over in northeast Africa as still a Christian kingdom. So now you'll have two Christian kingdoms, but predominantly still Muslim and Animism. Move southward to Angola. That's where they'll set up the port city of Luanda in the 1570s. We saw Angola being established in other chapters. This is just giving you a repeat a little bit more of the information. They'll also establish some areas in Mozambique. They're going to continue to go around the corner with establishing more forts on the Indian Ocean and Red Sea. A few settlers, so it's not as large as the western portion that they're going to have. Common European patterns in this, you're setting up trading stations, and the slave trade is going to start to become the central aspect, especially when they get their plantations set up on the islands outside in the Atlantic of Africa and Europe. Getting that established, they'll see the need for slavery, and that's when that begins to become the central point of trade. Again, make sure you're looking at your maps. All right, the trend toward expansionism, 1450 to 1850, 12 million African slaves are going to go over to the New World. About 10 to 11 million of them are actually going to make it. So anywhere from 10 to 20% of your slaves are going to die. A lot of those will die in that what's called that middle passage. That's where they're going from Africa right over to the Americas of the triangular trade. The 18th century will be your height with 80%, which was around 7 million slaves went over to the Americas during that time period. The Muslims will be in the Trans-Saharan region, and so they're going to be from the Red Sea, East Africa, and you're going to have about 3 million in that area. So altogether, 15 million, that's the low estimate. A lot of people think there might even been even more to the Americas and maybe a little bit more over going to the Muslim nations. But for the most part, you're looking at 12 million to the Atlantic, 3 million to the Muslim nations. Demographic patterns, the Sahara trade, that's going to be with the Muslims, mostly women, a lot of them going to the harems of those Muslim nations. And the Atlantic trade, primarily men, with the exception of the Southeast United States. You will have a little bit more of a population of the women that are going over to the Americas going to the Southeast United States. Excuse me. Again, maps, charts, please look at those online. Organization of the trade, Portuguese dominate first to 1630. Then the Dutch are going to come along and establish the Cape Colony in South Africa, and they will also seize Elmina in 1630, and they will rival the Portuguese. Following that, you'll have in the 1660s the English getting involved, and you'll have the royal monopoly set up down here, and the French in the 18th century will be heavily involved as well. They'll set up a monopoly as well, but not nearly as established as the English monopoly. Economics important, same profits as other trade. And in the beginning, actually even more. It was about 300%. It will slowly decline to around 5 to 10%. But your average trade overseas, it was still about the same profit. Value tied up with plantations and mining economy, that's two things. One, you're having to put more money back into your plantation and your mining area, but as those expand as well, or as they're not doing as well, will depend on if they need more slaves or don't need as many slaves, and so that's tied into the economy a little bit. And it definitely ties Africa into the global network now that is starting to occur with Europe expanding as much as it is. African society, slavery, and the slave trade. African slave traditions changed and intensified the use of slaves. It started off with about 50 a year, going up to Europe. Then about 500, you get to the thousands, couple hundred thousands. And again, by the 18th century, the 1700s, you're looking at 7 million slaves. The reason that this is going to increase is that when they set up the ports, they originally got consent to set these ports up. And what was happening is they were trying to capture slaves. That wasn't working out as well. And eventually they'll go to trading firearms. It's debatable whether the firearms and Europe's interaction with the slave trade developed African societies and political units, or if they were already in the means to getting to this point. But what ends up happening is they're starting to battle each other. They see firearms as the opportunity. The captives they have from war will be those that they have for slavery. It's also estimated that during that time period of the wars, which is the McCain, that another 4 million slaves will die, reaching wherever your war was or the interior kingdom is, bringing it back to those exterior kingdoms along the coast who profited the most with Europe. And so that's another number that you can add to that 1 to 2 million dying just in transport to the Atlantic. Slaving in African politics, West and Central Africa will become your main areas. You'll have small volatile states. I just mentioned the McCain, which was your wars. Again, sorry for mispronouncing it. Military becomes important to Zulu. We're going to look at these two things in a couple slides. And feeds into the slave trade. So again, just talked about that through firearms. And the states close to the coast dominate. Just mentioned that as well. Again, look at your trade routes that you have and where your slaves are going. Ashanti and Dahomey, the Ashanti Empire, which is the Akan people, are going to establish themselves in the Hausa Mandi area, and they will become a centralized state. This is important because you're seeing a little bit of an evolution within their political units and their structure. We'll eventually see, in a few slides, we'll see some absolute monarchs as well, and even some kings and councils. Ashanti Henna, that is your title of your ruler, which was Osei Tutu, and he is going to basically end up controlling trade with the Dutch and make a profit, especially with the firearms, and become a strong central force in that area, controlling all aspects of trade. The Benin are going to control trade with Europe, but not the slave trade. You'll still have the Europeans doing that. Some African states not dealing as much with military and slave trade, but still involved with trade because they see the opportunity for growth, and other kingdoms are trading with Europe, so they need to make sure they're taking advantage of that. The Dahomey people, the Fons people, are going to gain firearms by the 1720s. They are going to expand, and they are going to assimilate other royal families into their kingdom to make it even stronger. Other developments, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, divine right kinship, your absolute monarchs that you're going to have. Some areas like Yoruba are going to have a king and a council. One thing to note with Yoruba, just like we saw in chapter 8, they are patrons of the arts. They are extremely artistic, and they are going to continue to do that. Even when some of the large population of Yoruba is transferred over to Brazil, they still continue their artistic abilities. And here's an example of it. This is a bronze plate with statues. They even had life-size statues made out of ivory of their kings and priesthoods. East Africa and the Sudan. East Africa dealing more with Muslims, but you do have the Portuguese setting up ports over there for trade, and as the centuries continue on, you'll see more dominance of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean as the Muslims and Indians were not able to combat with them. The Swahili towns, you'll still have your ivory, gold, and slaves to the Middle East. Zanzibar will have a plantation with slaves and cloves. This is important to know. Most of your plantations are going to be in the Americas. You will have some coercive labor units, some small plantations in East Africa with Zanzibar, and a little bit in South Africa, but predominantly your plantations are located over in the Americas. The interior, you have the Luo dynasties near the Great Lakes, specifically the Victoria Lake. Again, you'll have some monarchs set up. The biggest thing that's going to occur is you're going to have an Islamization in this area that starts to take prominence in the areas, and they're going to work on purifying the Muslim nations that are in that area. You still had a mix between Ammonism and Muslims where they would accept Allah as another God with their beliefs, and so there was an effort to purify that region. And so that was occurring, and that ends up moving in pretty strong with the Hausa state, and you'll have Usman Don Fodio in 1804 established that, and he forms the new kingdom of Sokoto that is a strong Muslim establishment. All right, white settlers and Africans into southern Africa. You have the Bantu into southern Africa by 1500. We've talked about this because of their agricultural and pastoral knowledge and adaptation that they're able to travel down that far, and they start settling that area and establishing it. You'll have two major groups, the Koya and the San, and we'll later see them interact a little bit with the Dutch. The Dutch will form their colony in 1652, as mentioned earlier, and they will start having slaves as major estates. They'll have wars with the San and Koya, which were also in conflict a little bit with each other. You're going to have some Bantu wars that are occurring during the McCain in this area as well. Eventually, in the 1795, the Brits will occupy the colony, and in 1815 they'll take full possession of it. And after 1834, the Afrikaners push beyond their boundaries, and so this is when you have the Boers and you have the Great Trek, when your natives to that region are moving northeastward across the river to resettle their area because they're wanting their freedom that they have, because in 1834 you have the abolition of slavery in there. As you saw at the end of the chapter, 1807, William Wilberforce gets the slave trade, not that necessarily comes to a halt, but legally in the Parliament gets it to stop. The Mifkane and the Zulu rise to power. The Nguni people are going to be established by Shaka, who creates the Zulu Chieftain in 1818. He's a strong military ruler, a fierce ruler. He does expand his Zulu kingdom and the Zulu power. However, again, that cruelty, people rebel. He gets assassinated in 1828, and that leads to an all-out war. It was called Wars of Crushing and Wandering. Crushing, pretty self-explanatory. The wandering because of the displacement that it causes, and the families that are ruined, and the people just wandering, looking for new areas to settle and having to migrate. We'll even see to the point of the Swazi and the Lesotho people forming governments where they don't emphasize the military because they want to keep away from the wars that have been causing so much devastation. So between the slave trade and the wars and their own internal conflicts, a lot of historians believe that there's a lost generation just due to death that occurs in Africa because of this. All right, the slave trade and joining Africa to the world economy. Slaves' lives, you guys probably talked about this in the 8th grade, extremely cruel, especially depending on your master. It's not any kind of life that you would wish upon anybody. Millions killed, we've talked about that with the 1 to 2 million in transport, another 4 million in transport just in Africa, and also that's not, we don't even have numbers of slaves that were killed on their plantations to look at, but that number is astronomical as well, because that was one of the reasons why so many slaves were needed. You had a high mortality rate. Families destroyed, again, just mentioned that. Despite the families being destroyed, though, they tried their hardest to stay in family units and reunite as much as they could. Africans and the Americans, we talked about this earlier, they were on a plantation system. American slave society, saltwater slaves and Creole slaves. Saltwater slaves were those that directly came over from Africa. The Creole slaves were those that were mixed. So your social order is a little bit changed in the Americas, especially in Southeast United States where there was more of a Creole mix. So you had a mix of slaves. So you had your white social order, and then you had your mixed slaves, and then your saltwater slaves. You don't see the mixed slaves in Africa, and so your social order predominantly stays the same there. Again, I've included a few charts for you to help you out as well. Make sure you look at those. The people and gods in exile, hope. They would form new religions and bring religions over with them and continue to hold on to Islam or Christianity. A lot of them adopting Christianity on their plantations, especially in some of the Catholic areas and Protestant areas. Haitians will have voodoo or voodoo, and the English islands the obeah, and so those are strong groups. You'll even see the point of a Muslim rebellion with the Yoruba people. I know a lot of people ask, why was there not more runaway slaves? They outnumbered them. Fear. You weren't allowing the people to be educated. You were trying as hard as you could to keep these plantations owners were trying to try as hard as they can to keep the family units apart. They were obviously driving fear into them, even chained to a degree, and so they made rebellion as difficult because they did know they were outnumbered. And a lot that did run away did take the surname. That's where you'll get a mix of a lot of surnames that we have today. Here is some of the art that was brought over dealing with your different religions against Christianity here with the Kingdom of Ethiopia and East Africa and what was going on. The end of the slave trade, we've talked about this and studied in class with William Wilberforce and his efforts in Parliament in 1807, finally accomplishing that. Again, I highly recommend seeing the movie Amazing Grace, which was about that story. Causes, probably not economic, but self-interest. So again, you have the abolition movement with the beginning of the Enlightenment coming in. And the slave trade had slowly started to decrease as certain areas like the Southeast United States weren't needing as many slaves because they had a high birth rate and they didn't have as much mortality as some of the other areas. Was over by 1888 in the Americas, and we will actually see that in a few chapters where your last areas in Brazil and South America will abolish slavery altogether. And that concludes chapter 21.